trees are complicated. They're alive. They're little and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're just like us. They grow up and then they die.
These are strong, sturdy oak trees. They each have their own character and their own habits and idiosyncrasies, good and bad.
People used to go buy a house, and the first thing they do on the first weekend, they go out and plant a tree. They're talking about the future. This is no different. We're also talking about the past, and it's the contrast between those two which I think is going to be wonderful.
From the very first moments, we knew this was going to be the most important work we've ever done.
We need public space. It has such an important societal function for us. It's where we can find expression as not individuals, but as members of a community.
The thing that made me cry was the trees. It was the first sign of life here.
Life does rise from this rubble, from this mess.
We're restoring ourselves. We're coming back. We're in New York. And these trees bring that sense of restoration and serenity here.
One more time, guys. Round of applause. Catherine, you're just out here. Scott. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking time to come here and hang out with us today, Day of Days, and talk about this film. And congrats on this film. It really is. I was talking to you backstage. It's beautiful. It's optimistic. It's hopeful. It's all the things that I want out of this kind of film this time of year, and conjures up a lot of great conversations. Let's start at the beginning. I know it took you over 5 years, right, across 5 years to make this film. What was the very initial, the seedling, if you will, for this?
Well, it actually started on the subway, of all places. This was 2009, I think. I was riding on the subway, ran into a friend of a friend who was a landscape architect working at the firm who did the project. And he said, "Have you heard about the trees?" And I said, "No, I haven't heard about the trees." And he told me about the trees and said, "This would make a great documentary." And I said, "Well, I'll look into it." And the first thing that originally caught my eye as being, an interesting seed, if you will, was the fact that they found the trees in a 200-mile radius of New York. And in Pennsylvania and around D.C. And so there's this really interesting symbolic connection between 9/11 and the trees. And so I sort of pursued it and went down to the farm in New Jersey where they were storing the trees and growing the trees before they moved them into the city, and met Jason, who is
he's a character.
It's tough. If people haven't seen the film, it's hard. But he's
we'll get it.
Yeah. But
we'll give some context.
Yeah, but he's just as a filmmaker, you meet people and you're like, wow, this guy's great. Yeah. He's just funny and irreverent and kind of kooky tree guy, and just had this sort of just great outlook on trees and the project and the importance of the project. And so I just started filming him. Yeah. Kept coming back, kept meeting more and more interesting arborists, architects, and just kind of went from there.
Yeah, Jason, he's a movie unto himself. He could be a whole film. Self-proclaimed kooky tree guy. Yeah. I loved watching him. I mean, you want to talk about Zen moments, just like him working the trees and walking from tree to tree and like the sounds of the birds. But one tree in particular, the survivor tree, is kind of a big part of the story and a big part of the film. Did you know about that tree? Well, first, you know what? Before we get into that part, let's give a little bit of context. For those that aren't familiar with what the survivor tree is, can you tell us a little bit about that tree in particular?
Sure. The survivor tree was the last living thing to emerge from Ground Zero. And it was about a month or so after 9/11, when they were clearing the rubble, they found this stump of a tree there. Yeah. And you saw the picture from the trailer. Basically, it was a stump. It looked dead. But some guy said, "Well, actually, I think this is alive. Let's get the Parks Department down." Parks Department came down and said, "Yeah, this is actually alive." So they took it up to their nursery up in the Bronx and replanted it, and it grew back into a tree. And I started filming kind of right before they moved it back. But even then, if you looked at the tree, you can see the moment of the attack. So you can see the sort of scar on a branch. So you have this branch and then the scar and then new growth afterwards. So immediately when you look at the tree, it's just a very visual representation of the attacks, and it's very clear to see it. They decided to replant it back at the memorial, and I followed that whole process of the tree up in the Bronx and then moving it down and then how it's sort of changed after that. And that story is woven through the film. And I think it's really the heart of the film. It's what I mean, the film to me, it's about the building of the memorial, but it's really more about how we use nature, trees, to memorialize and to remember and, you know, to process tragedies. I think people really turn to living things as a way to deal with tragedy. So.
Well, there's definitely, and I don't want to say it was surprising, but there's a connection that the guys are nursing this tree back to health. It reminds me of like when you watch like a show like Pit Bulls and Parolees or something where they foster a dog back to health, and then they have to let basically, it reminds you of the connection of like a bond between like a human and an animal in a way, where they develop this deep bond and they kind of nurse it back to health and then release it off to go into the wild and do its life and live its life and find its new home and stuff. And these guys were very emotionally connected to this tree, to bringing it back. And then even to the point where when they were moving it back in and moving it back into the memorial, they're tearing up and they're crying over it and they're having this connection over this moment. Was that something you anticipated going in, seeing that level of emotion? Because it's a very emotional subject. It's a very complicated subject. But you're dealing with the trees. So were you surprised at all by that throughout the filming?
I was. I absolutely was. I didn't think... I mean, I thought these guys would be, you know, as one of them says in the film, this is the biggest job we're ever going to... Actually, a lot of them say that. This is the biggest job we're ever going to do. This is our opus. So I was not surprised by that, but I was surprised by the level of emotion. I mean, you saw what you say, the crying. And also, it's very interesting, when I screen the film, I do a lot of screenings for arborists organizations. And these big burly guys who climb up hundreds of feet into trees, they're in tears. And, you know, you don't expect those people to cry. So I think it does resonate, and I think that was surprising to me. And good for me. I mean, you know, always as a documentary filmmaker, you want to engage people and you want to give emotion. I don't like doing it cheaply, so I think the way we did it, which is very subtle, you know, people will be watching the film and then, you know, sort of midway through, they just burst into tears at a specific moment or random moments, and so that's really, I think that's nice.
Well, yeah, I want to talk about those moments, because we were saying backstage that the film is almost Zen-like, and it is. There's these beautiful moments, like rather it's a really rich, detailed shot where there's a tree in the foreground. You see the bark and all the structure, or even just like a father and his daughter playing in the grass, or like I said earlier, you know, Jason walking through the trees. As a filmmaker, when you're out there, are you looking for those Zen moments? And when you find them, how do you know where to place them within the context of the film?
Absolutely. I mean, I started making this film without a distributor. So, you know, if you're making a film and you're not making it for the Discovery Channel, you know, which has very specific rules about how you have to do it, you can do it however you want it. And I immediately said, I want this film to be meditative and have a really slow pace. It's my film. I'm self-funding it, at least until I did a Kickstarter. But, you know, so it was sort of my own baby. And so I absolutely did look for those little moments, and I wanted to really explore the details. Because in a lot of ways, too, the film, the trees are the main characters in the film, and the humans who are supporting them are the kind of supporting characters. So I really wanted to get those details as you would shoot a detail of a human being. So yes, I was looking for those, and then the editing process was a long process. I mean, we shot about 500 hours of footage, so it was a lot.
I was going to ask, yeah.
Yeah, so to whittle down to an hour-long film, you know, it was a long time, but we had a lot of that stuff. So I was really, if anything, it's more frustrating the things I had to cut out. But there's one scene in particular with Jason, and it's in the winter time in the snow, and he's down there by himself and just sort of meditating on the beauty of the trees in the winter. And that's one of my favorite scenes, because it's just so, he's philosophical, and it's you know, I don't know, beautiful and emotional, but he's also working, you know. I mean, it's a film about people who are doing hard, good work, and a lot of different types of people working, and so that's part of it.
Well, that was the thing too. I was watching it, and I was watching Jason like go on about the trees and like talking to them and all that stuff, and I was like, this is a guy that loves what he does. You know what I mean? And not in that way of like, oh, this guy really loves what he does. No, he genuinely found his calling, found his job, and he's the happiest dude in the world, just going from tree to tree. So I'm envious of him in that way. I wonder, the 5-year process, it's a long time. I think the subject matter necessitates that level of dedication, right? You're talking about trees here. But have you ever worked on a project before that you worked that long, that it took 5 years of consistent work? Yeah. Did you take breaks in between? Like, how did it...
Yeah, absolutely. It was certainly not 5 years of straight filming.
No,
that
couldn't be.
Would not have. In fact, I made a whole other film during the middle of that process. So, and we have a production company in New York, 590 Films. 590. We do, educational and nonprofit videos. So constantly doing, daytime job, pay the bills type work to help do this. So I don't know. I tried to every month or so do something and go in and check in and film. And, the guys were really good about getting back to me. The Memorial, very hard to film on. There was probably around the sort of before it opened, 20 documentary projects from HBO to PBS to Discovery doing it. So we were sort of bottom of the barrel. So it was always a fight to get on the plaza and film. It was a scrappy project, but independent project. But.
So it's obviously very much a passion, independent project. Katherine, when did you when did you get involved and become part of the project?
I found Scott on Kickstarter. I'm a TV producer in New York City, a longtime development producer. And you're always looking for your next idea and what can you connect with. And I routinely go through Kickstarter and see what programs there's a germ of something that speaks to me. And immediately, I've lived in New York for 25 years. Yeah. Immediately it spoke to me. And this was back in 2014. Scott and I were just saying 3 years ago. And he had done a beautiful little 6-minute piece for the New York Times. And so I could see how his vision was and how soft the film was. Mm-hmm. And I especially being 9/11 today, it's weird today. Yeah. To the hard and soft of New York, I think we come up against all the time. It's tough to live here, and so I think you either rail against New York or it softens you. And what Scott's vision for the film did to me, it spoke to the softest part in us that wasn't destroyed that day. And his film is really a metaphor on grief to me. And even the landscape architect says in the film, people, when they buy a house, the first thing they do is plant a tree. And just as Scott was just talking, it hit me, sometimes when you plant a tree, you're not there when it grows. So you do it for yourself, but you do it for just to plant some life and growth in the world. And I know we've all moved away from our childhood homes. You go back and the house looks different and it's painted different, but the tree has grown. And that's what I think if I could give some major props to Scott. The 5-10 years from now, he has historically marked the building of that memorial for New York City and for all time. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it'll all look the same down there. The buildings will be the same, concrete, the pools will look the same, but the trees will show us how much time has gone by. And it's going to be like a canopy like in Central Park down there. And I was just saying to Scott, the first time someone maybe has their wedding pictures taken down there, it'll be weird, but it'll be hopeful. And I think we all can place years from now, even the children of the people who were lost that day will go back there and take that place back for themselves. Yeah. And that it's not a place of sadness, it's a place for growth.
Yeah, beautifully said. You were going to say?
Yeah, and what's interesting about the survivor tree, too, is when large tragedies happen around the world, good example is the Paris nightclub bombing. People kind of go there and they put flowers down and mementos, and it's become this kind of organically this gathering place for people to memorialize tragedy, which I find interesting. And I should say the audience too. You can after the ceremonies, you can go down there today, and it's a very sad day to go, but it's also interesting because you see the little mementos that people leave. They stick them in the names on the wall, and in front of the survivor tree there'll be just tons of stuff, and so it's powerful and interesting too because the museum collects all of the non-perishable parts of those mementos, puts them into the museum collection. So it's kind of an ongoing, organic thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering. And watching the film, I said was almost like a Zen sort of experience, a meditative experience, which was intended. And we talk about the connection between the growth and the metaphor between the trees and all that. And I'm wondering how meta this gets. Was it a catharsis? Like, was there a cathartic experience for you in making this film, which in turn can be cathartic for somebody else? Like, did you process any of your feelings or emotions through the making of this film?
Absolutely. I mean, I was working over on the West Side Highway on 9/11 and walked down, and it was incredibly traumatic for me. And I always knew I wanted to make something, and I didn't want to do a sort of more traditional story. I wanted to do something that was more about looking forward. And a lot of the film it features kids processing the story. And there's an interesting article in the Times today about a girl who's was a baby when her father died, and she's making this documentary all about kids who are now. I mean, it's very so it was absolutely cathartic for me, especially because I love gardening and nature, and so to get to explore that. And part of my favorite film is part of the film is when we focused on the women from the Forestry Service who were doing a sort of analysis of all of the living memorials around the country that have sprouted up, and we sort of followed them to a couple of these memorials to see where people are planting flowers or building little gardens, just sort of organic things as a way to memorialize 9/11, and I find that very interesting.
And when something's destroyed and you feel helpless, the simplest thing you can do is plant something. Right. Again, it's just a renewal, and Scott has used that phrase or that word for the last couple of years that I've known him. It renews your sense in something simple. That before Manhattan was even here, hundreds of years ago, the first stuff that was here were sheep and trees and meadows, and that's why we flock to Central Park. If we didn't have the parks around the city, or the beautiful parks that are in Brooklyn, we'd be destroyed, I think, emotionally. There wouldn't be some place where the first thing I love to watch when people go to Central Park, we all kick off our shoes because it's so nice to just hang in the grass, and it makes you feel like you were a kid again. And I mean, I see you all like nodding because it's such a universal. And if I could just brag a little bit about Scott, he followed this film. This is what I think is a metaphor about Scott and the masterful way he put this film together, which, by the way, you can all get on video on demand, which we're going to tell you all in many, many different ways.
Is it airing tonight on PBS?
No, it aired last week.
Oh, it aired last week.
Yes,
okay.
It aired on the 15th anniversary on PBS here in New York, and then they just re-aired it again.
It's available
last
on demand.
Scott didn't know how, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but he didn't know how his film was going to end. He just started documenting it, and knowing that it would be an important way for him to grieve and possibly other people to grieve. And that's what's great about documentary filmmakers. You don't always know your process. And I think it's a metaphor with the planting of the trees in that whole area. He didn't know either, but he had enough confidence in himself to go forward. And that's how great art is created. When next time you go down to that space, you're going to look at that space completely different now, because people don't, unless you notice the trees or they're pointed out to you, I don't think you look at them. But they are like soldiers down there, guarding that area.
One of the things that's fascinating about this film I was watching, I loved it, was not just the story and everything that kind of surrounds it, but also the engineering little tidbits of the way, if you approach it from the south, how the trees appear different than if you approach it from the east or west, and the irrigation system. Like, on top of all of these beautiful things, there's also like a nice little nerdy part that gets to geek out and look at how they made this. And
I love construction films.
Oh my God, it's so cool! Yeah, and all
men always do love construction sites. But it's the biggest. It's the biggest forest in
Well, I mean, it's
clearly in the city, but
yeah, its biggest claim to fame is that it's one of the largest green roofs in the world. So technically, I mean, you can look here. This plaza here looks like it's a flat plane, but underneath it is 7 stories of museum and trains and shopping centers and stuff like that. So the engineering feat was, and cost was mind-boggling.
Yeah, I can't even fathom.
And can I say one thing about the survivor tree? All the trees are, there's 420 of them.
Oak trees.
Yeah, oak trees. But the survivor tree is a pear tree. So it looks different. And it's so interesting to me, there's no plaque that says this tree survived the attacks. But when you go down there, people are just drawn to the tree because all of them look like this. But the pear tree is like a dome. It sticks out. It's different. And you can, and clearly on one side is completely, not in formation. But Scott's right. When you go down there, look at the branches. It is like it was amputated.
It's fascinating.
And grew. You can see the exact moment in all the branches, because the branches afterward did not grow like they did before.
Yeah.
They grew differently.
Yeah. And also, what I thought was fascinating is that they've been saving like the tree and sort of germinating little newer trees from that one, and they've been sending them all over the world to help people plant and process green. It's beautiful. Honestly, I can't say it enough. The film tells a beautiful story. It's shot beautifully. I do have to turn it over to audience Q&A, but I assure you, I could keep telling you how awesome I think this movie is for quite some time. We're going to turn over. We have some mics in the room. Our first question appears to be over there.
So I am actually a New York City tour guide, so I super geek out over anything like landscape, and I especially love the intentional public outdoor spaces that we have in this city. And this particular project, by its nature, pun intended, is going to be a place where people can make their own memories outside of the tragedy that was 9/11. So my question is, how do you anticipate that this memorial, which has multiple access points of meaning, will evolve both the landscape of the city and evolve in terms of the collective memory of this city?
That is a great question, and it's totally dealt with in the film. So you should take a look. But I think it's told in the film. So there's a piece in the film where they talk about how there's too many rules and then too many restrictions. I mean, we read about people going down there and trying to sing or have gatherings, and they are basically told they can't do it. And that's the rule. And the architect mentions that he uses the example of the Lincoln Memorial, which was built in the 20s. And he says the idea that they would have the I Have a Dream march and speech there, when that memorial was built, was just inconceivable that would happen. So I think that it's a time thing. I think that further down the road, the memorial will evolve and will change over time. And I think it's hard to know what will happen. But right now there probably are too many rules, and you probably can't assemble there, and you can't protest. That said, people do go down there and use it as a park. I mean, in the film, and if you just go down there and observe, you'll see the Condé Nast buildings right there. You'll see people eating their lunch in the plaza, and coming down and using it as a park next to people who are coming and mourning their victims, the victims of 9/11. So it's a very complicated space, and I think that there's hard to answer that question right now, but I think over time that question will become more answerable.
For sure. Next question's right here in the front.
Yes.
So you mentioned about having trouble finding an ending when you originally started. How did you end up finding an ending, and what were the challenges in that?
Well, the challenges was when to stop. If you talk to my wife, she jokes that this is the film that went through 2 girlfriends, an engagement, a marriage, and a baby. So it was a very long process. So it needed to end. But I wanted to really see how, and this goes actually back to the last question, I wanted to see how the space, rather than just when they opened the memorial, which was at the 15th anniversary, how the space really did try and integrate back into the city. How did New Yorkers use it? How was it used as a tourist destination? And so I could have finished 4 years ago, right when they opened the memorial at the 15th anniversary, or I guess was it 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I said, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going because I want this film to really be a little bit bigger than that. So I kept going for another year. And then finally I was just like, I have to stop. I mean, there wasn't one moment. I missed the installation of the last tree, which would have been a great moment, but the guy he just didn't call me. So,
wait, after working on it, was it a new guy? Was it?
No, it was the old guy who, it was a struggle. It was a struggle, and it goes back to the fact that this was a guy who was in probably 10 films, the star of a couple of them. He was kind of the big deal, and so I think he didn't realize that this would be like it kind of crushed me, but I don't think it. At the end of the day, it doesn't hurt the film at all.
No. I wouldn't say that it does.
And if I can add one thing, Scott cast the people in the film brilliantly. One of the tour guides that you meet, a woman, Anne Van Heijn, you meet her, and she's talking about what happened that day, and you don't know until she divulges it that she lost her husband that day, and all the tour guides down there have lost someone. But then the masterful, I keep using that word because it's true, was that her husband was a firefighter and also an arborist. So, do you know any arborists? I do not know any arborists. So that's such a rare thing that she would be a tour guide, he would be a firefighter, but also love trees. So for her, you see this metamorphosis on her face that when she goes down there, she gets to spend time with him.
Yeah.
And right, it's like she's having lunch with her husband. And so it's not a sad place. When I bring people, I went down again 2 weeks ago when I knew September 11th was coming up. And I brought someone who hadn't been down for 15 years. And she just kept looking up and she was just marveled. And she had watched the film and knew the story of the trees. And she said, this is not a sad place. This is you almost want to invite your friends to come down instead of avoiding it. And that's what Scott did. He took tactile things like dirt and acorns and sprigs, and he made them, they're the stars of the film, but we feel we can, if they can make it, we can grow through it. It sounds a little corny, but it's incredibly sweet, and that's at the heart of his film.
Yeah, for sure. I believe we have one more. We have time for one more question. It's going to come from...
After making this documentary, does your perspective change at all when you look at any tree in the whole world? And who designed the movie poster?
Sorry, who designed the
movie poster?
Oh, the movie poster was a gentleman named Gary Irwin, who's out of Scranton, Pennsylvania. His company's called Variant Media, and it's a great poster, right? I love it. Sorry, what was the first part of this? Sorry.
Did it change your perspective on trees?
Oh, yeah.
Period?
Well, I learned a lot more about different types of trees. And now I can walk down the street and identify trees. And I learned that the survivor tree, actually, which is a pear tree, is actually an invasive tree. And so there was certain people who didn't think that it should be replanted because it sends its seeds out and it sort of infests. So that's been a bit of a problem. I got into a Twitter battle with someone about that who was very angry about that fact.
But it blooms. It blooms.
Yeah, in April. It's April. It's beautiful.
So when everything is green down there, that's when you can really see what is this tree doing here? It looks completely different than the other ones.
Yeah.
And I should also just say too, I think you mentioned that it's online, but you can see the film on iTunes. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can watch it for free on Amazon Prime, Google Play.
Yeah.
Pretty much everything.
Beautiful. Well, regrettably, we're out of time. I got to let you guys go, but you already said everywhere you can see the film. Guys, I can't encourage you enough to go check it out. It is beautifully done. It makes you feel good, which is a crazy thing to be able to say about a documentary about such a tragic day, right? But you found an angle and you found a facet to this story that I don't think a lot of us have seen yet, and highly recommended. One more time, please make some noise for Katherine and Scott. Guys, this is a beautiful film, The Trees.